All right. Are we live? I guess we're live. Very good. This might be still figuring things out here, but good afternoon. My name is Pastor Caleb Maltby. I am not joined by Carl Miller, Reverend Carl Miller down in New Braunfels, nor Will O'Brien. They're both very busy at the present, have been. We've all been very busy with different things. I with the church, Carl Miller with the church down there in New Braunfels, and Will has a new baby, actually. So very exciting for him. And we are we're very excited to be able to do other things, just have been busy with the things that God has given us and tasked us, our normal duties, which is all wonderful. And internet things, podcasting things like that, they are secondary, as they ought to be. I know that many people in our modern world are obsessed with being online. Online is great. It is wonderful. Social media gives so many opportunities that our ancestors did not have access to. And yet, the real world is still where we should spend most of our time, most of our days, with the people that are right in front of us. And so that means that lately, that has been where my time has been invested. But I did want to record some things. There are still things on my mind. I'm still reading lots and lots of things. And I wanted to bring some of that to you. And today, actually, it made so much sense to start with a lecture that I prepared for my own church that I delivered yesterday. And it was kind of very providential, because we kind of do the way we do our Sunday schools at Covenant Presbyterian is we have quarters. We do it by quarters, and we switch the curriculum up each quarter, different topic, going through things, systematic theology, sometimes going through a book, sometimes going through a book of the Bible, and doing straight exposition and exegesis. And we had a book that we were going through, a wonderful book by Sinclair Ferguson on the Holy Spirit, which I would recommend to you if you are interested in studying the Holy Spirit. And that book was only, I think it was only 12 chapters, and we had 13 weeks in the quarter. So we needed to fill that one last week before we went into our quarter, which we're going to be starting here on Easter Sunday, this next coming Sunday in April. And so we needed a one-off Sunday school. And so I suggested that I lecture on one of my favorite topics, which is J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, and how Christianity informed how he wrote the Lord of the Rings, how he wrote the Hobbit, and many different aspects and themes, as many virtues are put on display, many Christ-like figures are written into the story. And the session really liked that idea. So I was able to thankfully give that lecture. Unfortunately, I just forgot to record it. So we normally record our Sunday schools. We normally have the books put on sermon audio. And so I thought, you know what? Why don't I record it for the Texan Reformers YouTube channel, which has been silent for a long time. And so that is what I'm going to be doing today. I plan to do some more recording in the mornings before I start work. I have a few things in mind. So do keep that in mind. I'll probably record something tomorrow around the 8 o'clock hour before work starts, if you would like to join us for that. I do want to talk about piety and prayer and fasting and things that really just aren't talked about a lot in the Reformed world. So I want to maybe do a series on that, maybe 4 or 5 parts, talking about not just why we should pray, but how we should pray, and really get down to the practicalities of that. So do stay tuned for that. And of course, everything live streamed will also be recorded and shot straight over to the YouTube channel. But without further ado, let's jump into this lecture. And maybe there'll be more lectures to come on J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who, of course, are two good friends and two writers who really influenced my thinking a lot, and the theology and philosophy and just overall thinking of so many individuals. But why would I give a Sunday school lecture on Lord of the Rings? That doesn't seem like something that a Reformed pastor would do. We're not known for having kind of pop culture bleed into our Sunday school, and rightly so. I mean, we don't want to just create a Sunday school around Marvel, let's say, or some kind of pop culture phenomenon. And yet, Tolkien and Lewis are unique in the fact that they were so self-consciously Christian, in the way that they wrote. Lewis it's much more obvious, right? And he didn't just write fiction, he also wrote other things. And the fiction that he did write was highly allegorized, right? If you read the Chronicles of Narnia, it is inescapable how Christian the works of the Chronicles of Narnia are, especially as you look at a character like Aslan, who is clearly a Christ figure, not just someone who is Christ-like, but a lion that is meant to symbolize the Lord Jesus Christ. And yet, Tolkien, he doesn't do that. And he doesn't do that very intentionally. And so it may be a little less obvious, right? The Lord of the Rings, he insisted, was not an allegory. He said if it was about anything, firstly, it was about itself, is how he phrased it in the introduction to the Silmarillion, which we'll talk about here in a second. So why study the Lord of the Rings? Why study this fiction that he wrote from a theological or Christian perspective? Well, I think that brings us to a very important topic that many people miss, which is that Christians should be reading, I believe, should be reading fiction. At the very least, should be reading narrative. Of course, history has many narratives itself. And let me bring up my screen here. The reason why we're not broadcasting in the morning today is because I spent all day trying to figure out technology so that I could have a whiteboard, which I normally do whenever I'm lecturing in the church here at Covenant Presbyterian. But so why should Christians read fiction? Well, I am reminded of my time in seminary. And there was a good friend of mine, who we're still good friends. He's still up there in the Philadelphia area where we went to school at Westminster Seminary. And we got into do a discussion one time. He was discussing reading. I was discussing reading. We were discussing this coming out of chapel, I believe. And I asked him what fiction he had been reading lately. And I'm an English major, but my undergraduate was an English major, so I love to read fiction, and I try to be reading fiction most of the time. And he said he hadn't really read fiction in a while, and I found that to be a pretty common response for people up there, especially in the midst of seminary, right? You've got all these nonfiction works you have to get through, works of theology and trying to get through Greek and Hebrew and things like that. So totally understandable. But then he said something that made me pause. He said, I don't know how much time a pastor should spend reading fiction. And I said, what? And he said, yeah. He said, come to think of it, I don't know how much time a Christian should spend reading fiction. I mean, it's good, it's okay. I mean, but it's kind of just like scrolling through YouTube. I mean, it's just a way to pass the time, right? It's just relaxing, but it's not really beneficial necessarily. And this made me pause, made me think. I argued with him vehemently for probably many hours. Ended up going to his house that night, and we continued the discussion. But I don't know if I had a good answer for him at the time, and now I'm beginning to formulate an answer. I do think that it is true that Christians ought to read fiction. And maybe the first reason comes from the Bible itself. I want you to think of what is the main genre of the scriptures? What is the main genre of the kind of writing that the scriptures bring to us? Why read fiction? The scriptures give to us many different genres of writing, right? The Psalms are poetry. The letters of Paul. They are letters by genre, but they really are, in one way, nonfiction in the most pure sense, right? They are arguments. They are explaining different theological topics from premises to their natural conclusions via different arguments that Paul makes. And not just Paul, right? Of course, we're talking about St. Peter and St. John as well. We can look at the prophets, right? The prophets kind of give these exhortative they're poetic in some sense, but more exhortative and warning to the children of Israel because of the sin that they found themselves in and them breaking the covenant bond and agreement they've made with their God. And these prophets are warning them what's going to happen if they break that covenant and they go against God and begin to go after other idols. We can think of the wisdom literature, right? That would be like Proverbs. That would be like Ecclesiastes. looking at different proverbs that help you to know generally how to live a good life before the Lord. And yet the vast majority of the scriptures come to us not in argument, but in the form of narrative, in the form of a story. The Gospels themselves, right? While the majority of the books in the New Testament are epistles making arguments about theology, which are very helpful in interpreting the Gospels and many of the things that Jesus says and does, the Gospels themselves, along with the book of Revelation, which is a prophecy but also has a lot of narrative in it as well, makes up a huge chunk of the New Testament. Of course, the Old Testament makes a huge chunk even further, right? I mean, you're talking about the Pentateuch. Along with all of its laws, most of what the Pentateuch is a story that starts from creation, goes to the choosing of Abraham and his kin to be God's chosen people, and all the way through they're going up to the Promised Land, which then is, of course, immediately followed by them going into the Promised Land, the story of the kings, the story of the exile, etc., etc. It's quite a hefty chunk of the Old Testament that is brought to us in narrative. Us in the Reformed world, maybe this would kind of come to us in a package that we wouldn't have chosen if we were the one to choose scriptures. Now, thank God we are not the ones that choose how God reveals himself to us. He alone knows what is best, and he chose to tell us, firstly, a story. And the other genres of writing come to us to explain that story in different ways. And I'll have you know, right, that it's not just the arguments that Paul gives. It's explained through things like the Psalms that are poetic, right? Or things like the Proverbs that are practical wisdom for day-to-day life. But it is primarily a story. And what is the thing that we preach and we proclaim each and every Sunday, and we should be proclaiming throughout our lives to people that do not know it? What is the primary thing they need to hear in one word? It is the gospel. And the gospel is what? The gospel is primarily a story. It is delivered to us in a story. The things that are called gospels, most literally in the scriptures, are the four gospels according to the four evangelists. And what is an evangelist? Evangelist is someone who tells the evangel. An evangelist is just Greek for gospel. So if there is a reason to read fiction, it is firstly that the primary form that the scriptures come to us in is narrative. God loves narrative. He actually loves it so much that when we think about the way the human soul and the human mind is created, and this perhaps really gets at the deeper reason why reading fiction is important. If firstly, it's because the scriptures and the gospel itself, it comes to us in story form. The second is that our brains and our minds were not created like machines, like computers. How does a computer store information? It stores information just by putting it into a whole bunch of files and categorizing all of that information like a machine would, categorizing it, alphabetizing it, and putting it in different folders and subfolders, etc. Is that how the human mind remembers information or consumes or digests information? No. We interpret information and then remember that information via stories. Stories are something that we cling to. We enjoy watching movies. We enjoy reading books that have good stories in them because our minds are primarily made as story receivers, or as those things that receive narrative. Narrative really is meaning. It is turning all of these brute facts that just kind of exist out in the ether, that as they exist out in the ether are fairly useless to us. But when they come to us in a story, in a narrative, that is when we actually begin to impose or perceive, really, meaning inherent in those facts. And you'll notice this all the time when you see a good teacher standing up to deliver a lecture. How does he bring you in? How does he help you to remember all of his lecture? He organizes it like a story, and he tells stories throughout that lecture. And so if the first reason is that the scriptures tell us stories all the time, let's see if this will The second is that our minds receive stories, whether those stories are fictitious or true. And fictitious, I think we're gonna hit that in a second. Fictitious in the sense that they didn't literally happen, right? It doesn't mean that truths are not to be found in them. And the scriptures give us an example for this too, right? When Jesus teaches, how does he teach? Firstly, he teaches through parables, right? He teaches the story of the sower who goes out to sow a field. And that image is imprinted on your mind, and you can really begin to think through what does that mean about the visible church and the spreading of the gospel, and those that hear the gospel, and some who take it very quickly and then fall away, or those who actually take it and have it their whole lives, or those that take it and then they reject it outright very quickly. And it makes you think and ponder about what that is and how that works itself out in real life more than you would had that just been delivered to you in a systematic theology, right? So even our Lord understood the importance there of using story, of using parables in order to communicate those truths that he wanted to communicate. And so for these two reasons, I think it's very important that we read fiction. It also is good for theologians to hear, for those that may be going to seminary to hear, that you shouldn't be just doing theology all day, and having some kind of outlet to begin to read stories, good stories. We'll talk about that at the end. That is a good and healthy way to diversify your skills, and to not just become so pinpointed on one thing. There's one problem with our culture in academia right now. It is that everyone has pigeonholed themselves, and we all become specialists, and therefore none of us are good at anything but maybe one thing. Maybe we're really good at that, but we actually even suffer in our own specialized field by losing other things. So fiction, even for that reason, is good. And for pastors, for those that are aspiring to be pastors, sometimes I have thought to myself, a lot of the success that I have in communicating truths to other people has been the ability to make analogies and to make kind of parables at times. You can't really do that if you're not reading fiction, if you're not reading stories. So this is perhaps why, the justification for why we should learn about fiction and what Tolkien then is doing with fiction. Who is J.R.R. Tolkien? J.R.R. Tolkien, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien is what that stands for. Tolkien is a Britishman who fought in the First World War. He taught in Oxford afterwards, came back to Oxford, and is best known for his, of course, Lord of the Rings and Hobbit that he wrote during his lifetime. He wrote many other things while he was there at Oxford, and he is very commonly associated with C.S. Lewis because he and Lewis formed a group called the Inklings Group, which primarily was concerned with writing fiction. Tolkien, Lewis, Barfield was another, these were men who would meet on a weekly basis, and they would bring manuscripts of the works that they were writing, and they would read it aloud to each other, and then they would, the others would actively give critiques of their manuscripts. And these were men who were highly trained in their fields, mainly literature fields, and men who were very concerned with story and how that story kind of pointed back to, or was found within the tradition of many old myths. For these same men had been meeting for a long time before, discussing many of the old myths, really the ones that come from the English tradition, the Old English tradition, or the Old Norse tradition. So they read a lot of Old Norse sagas, a lot of Norse mythology is included in that. But the one that really is most important for our purposes and for J.R.R. Tolkien is the story of Beowulf. If you have not read Beowulf, you ought to read Beowulf. It's not very long, and there are many great translations, including one that Tolkien himself made. Beowulf is the story of a great hero, right? So a lot of these old sagas, these old stories that come to us are about these great heroes. And maybe the ones that are most important in Western civilization is Homer and Virgil. That is the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. Beowulf kind of stands in that same category, but for the English and for their tradition. It is in Old English, a language that if you tried to read, you would not recognize it. It is closer to modern German than it is to modern English because of the influence that French and Latin has had upon our language over the centuries. And yet this was something that Tolkien gravitated to, the story of this great hero Beowulf. And he is called to a distant land because in this land, the king is being harassed, or his men are being harassed by a evil monster, a terrible monster called Grendel, who comes in to the mead hall during the night while the men are sleeping and takes off one or two to his lair to hack apart and eat. And so the king is very worried about this. Beowulf comes over. He begins to brag for a long time, and really that the point of that is to prove his worth, to prove his virtue as a man. And what I mean by virtue is really courage, strength, which is something that Tolkien and others will call a pre-Christian virtue. We'll talk about that in a second as well. And after he proves that through the stories he tells about himself, then he waits for Grendel to come in the night, and then he fights him and ends up killing him. And we then hear about the second episode in which Grendel's mother, infuriated that her son is dead, comes to attack, and then in another great epic battle, Beowulf kills Grendel's mother. And then we get this curious third episode in which Beowulf has grown old and has become king of his people. And he is old and wise, and many look up to him. And there is a man, one of his subjects, who foolishly hears about a hoard of gold that a dragon is sleeping on and guarding. And so he goes to steal a golden cup from this hoard of gold and awakens the dragon. And the dragon begins to terrorize Beowulf's people. And he then takes a retinue of his men and goes to fight this dragon. In the end, though, he is mortally wounded. Even though killing the dragon, he is mortally wounded and gives up his life for the sake of his people, that they might not be slaughtered anymore by this dragon. Now, that last kind of episode there is very interesting. It does fall out of the line of many of the different stories of old, because this does have some very Christian imagery to it, right? The writer of Beowulf, of the Beowulf saga, is very clearly a Christian. It is a Christian saga. Some speculate as to whether the story existed prior to this writer writing about it. But it is clearly someone who is very familiar with the scriptures, very familiar with Christian theology. And we can't help but notice that while the first two episodes have the pre-Christian virtue of virtue and honor and valor and strength and courage, right? These are virtues that would be in all of the old epics, right? If you read the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Aeneid, these are virtues that all of the great heroes in those stories exemplify. But the laying down his life for the sake of his people, even on account of something that he didn't do, right? It wasn't his fault the dragon woke up. That was one of his subjects. And yet he still lays down his life that his people might live. You can't help but hear the echoes of Jesus Christ and what he did. For while he shows the virtue of courage, the Lord Jesus Christ does, he also shows this virtue of sacrifice and of humility as he comes in lowliness, and he sacrifices his life on account of his people, even on account of their sin, that they might be saved. And so this is something that is not lost on J.R.R. Tolkien. It affects him profoundly. And many have talked about how this one poem that was almost relegated to the dustbin of history, that many scholars didn't want to pay attention to, Tolkien said, no, we should pay attention to it for its mastery of the poetry and the themes that are brought out in it, and pay attention to it just like any other great work. And many now see the kind of transitionary phase between the old pre-Christian world and the virtues that are inherent there, but then the new post-Christian world or not post-Christian world, but Christian world that Beowulf and the monk taking down this story is living in. and maybe trying to marry the two virtues. That courage, of course, is a pre-Christian virtue, that it is existing in pre-Christian societies, and yet it is still a Christian virtue. It is still a good thing as well. And so we see Beowulf exemplifying that courage, but then also pairing that with sacrifice, right? And laying one's own life down, which in this culture, this Germanic culture where there was plenty of valor and courage to go around in battle, what plagued it was that everyone was taking what was called the weregeld, or the blood that was owed. If you killed your someone from one town, well, then they could come over and kill someone from your town, and a feud would continue to cycle in on itself. How is that cycle broken? Well, it is broken clearly by the one who clearly gives up his own life, right? And the sacrifice and humility is so apparent there. One could say that Tolkien bases his first popular work on Beowulf, and that first popular work, of course, is The Hobbit. And so I do want us to see the clear connection there. Beowulf does inform The Hobbit. It's not a retelling of Beowulf necessarily. It's very different in many respects. Beowulf is not a hobbit. He is a man. And Bilbo Baggins clearly does not have the same kind of braggadocious and very courageous nature, especially at the beginning of the story. But it is about a dragon. And it is about a dragon who sits upon a lot of gold. And a dragon that is awoken by this greed. And we'll talk about that. Avarice is a huge theme within The Hobbit. And it also exemplifies, perhaps, it kind of reverses things. Whereas in Beowulf, we start with the virtue of courage already in the main character, and then the virtue of humility and laying one's own self-interest down for the other, even in the midst of the other sin, even because of the other sin. But that comes in the later part of the story. In The Hobbit, it's reversed, right? If you are familiar with The Hobbit starts with a very unassuming character, Bilbo Baggins, that Tolkien just came up with one day while he was grading papers. Tolkien, and this was true of Lewis too, right? Professors in Oxford were not well paid, and so they had to come up with other ways of making money. So in the modern world, many people that are teachers have graders, right? They pay graders to grade their papers and the tests that they administer. And so Tolkien and Lewis both would pick up some extra cash in order to support them and their families by grading throughout the weeks, and not just teaching. So one day Tolkien is grading, and as he's grading, he just turns over an essay, and he takes out his pen, and he writes, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," which is the famous first line of The Hobbit. He just wrote this line out, and he doesn't know exactly why it came to him, but as he stared at the line, he said to himself, well, I had best think of a name for this hobbit. And by the by, I should probably come up with what a hobbit is, and proceeded to write 16 to 20 pages concerning hobbits, which in its revised form is found at the beginning of most copies of the Fellowship of the Ring. And from there, he began to develop a story about this hobbit, Mr. Baggins, and it was really written for his children. Most of the stories that he had written up to this point were stories that he wrote for his children. He had already gotten into the habit of writing stories about Father Christmas, which are very funny, about how Father Christmas gets presents to all the girls and boys, but all the misadventures that his sidekick, a polar bear, a talking polar bear, gets to while he helps Santa Claus get all the presents to the children. And so that was really what Tolkien's MO for writing stories was at this point. It was for kids, for his children. And so that was what The Hobbit was originally. It became something far more, and became this novel in which we see a small, unassuming, not very courageous hobbit become someone who finds his courage, and yet his unassuming and humble and lowly nature that he has from the beginning is actually what ends up saving not only him, but all of his friends as well. And I want to read how one of the things at the beginning. I'm going to read many different parts of the of both Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and the Hobbit. And I want to read just part of the song from the dwarves, because we are introduced to Bilbo at the beginning of the story. And these dwarves come into the Hobbit's house, and after eating all of his food and drinking all of his beer and making a whole mess of his house, and he's quite annoyed at this, they finally begin to tell him or express why they're here, why they're gathered, and what this adventure is. And they start by singing a song. And I'm not going to sing it, I'm just going to read the poetry. But really, the poetry of the Lord of the Rings is beautiful and an unskippable part for those that are working their way through Tolkien's work. He spent a lot of time on the poetry. They sang this: far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day to seek the pale enchanted gold. The dwarves of yore made mighty spells, while hammers fell like ringing bells. In places deep where dark things sleep, in hollow halls beneath the fells. For ancient king and elvish lord, there many a gleaming golden hoard they shaped and wrought, in light they caught, to hide in gems on hilt of sword. On silver necklaces they strung, the flowering stars on crowns they hung, the dragon fire in twisted wire, they meshed the light of moon and sun. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to claim our long forgotten gold. And I'll stop there for time's sake. This song tells you a lot about the dwarves, who they are, what it is that they want, what it is that they desire, which is very important for the story. Old musicals, Rodgers and Hammerstein talked about this, that whenever there was a main character in their stories, that the first song normally that they would write for the musical was called the I Want song. And it's very clear all over musicals. It's if you are familiar with Disney at all, right? The story of Ariel, the Little Mermaid, which is a terrible story, and we'll not get into that, has at the beginning a song that she sings where she says, I want to be where the people are, right? So now we have this establishment of the desire of the main character and how that's either going to be thwarted or fulfilled by the end of the story. This is the quote-unquote I Want song for the dwarves, so that we know what it is that they desire. And what is it that they desire? We must away ere break of day to claim our long-forgotten gold. They want gold. They want the gold that was stolen from them by Smaug the dragon. Wanting gold is not necessarily a bad thing, and yet in the human heart, it almost always tends toward something sinful. And that brings me to something that is very obvious throughout all of The Lord of the Rings. Let's see if I can spell this correctly. Concupiscence. Concupiscence, which is derived from a Latin word that is used by St. Augustine over and over, that we could really translate desire. Many of the translators in St. Augustine's works will translate that as lust. And yet in the English language today, this word, lust, really has sexual connotations. And for Augustine, that was one of his primary temptations throughout his younger life, and really throughout his life, it was that too. But this word in the German has not attached the sexual component to it. It really just has to do with desire, right? Desiring something, and is a neutral term in that sense in the German language. And so I think desire really is the best translation of it. But desire for something that is not God. And it is a bent kind of desire, right? Humans have desires. And there are sinless desires. That is, we want to eat. We want to drink, right? Because they are necessary for life. These passions are sinless passions, and they are not wrong. And yet, since the fall, and this is what Augustine wanted to emphasize, we have these bent desires, these bent passions. Sometimes they're passions that are sinless, the want for food, bent into something more extreme, something more sinful, gluttony, right? Overindulgence. And sometimes they are just desiring that which is wrong, right? And he goes into explicit detail on this when he talks about him stealing the pear when he was a very young child. He didn't want it because he was hungry. He wanted it because he wanted the thrill of stealing something from someone. That is a bent desire. There's no way to make that lesser desire so that you are not in sin. The desire to steal and to be thrilled by stealing is sinful inherently. And so he says we all have that now in us since our days of birth because of the original sin. And that really is getting into the doctrine of original sin. So we have this concupiscence now overshadowing many things in our lives. And this concupiscence is important because we are told at the beginning of the story of The Hobbit what it is that the dwarves want. They want gold, and they're going to go on this adventure for said gold. And the obstacle in the way is not only getting there, right? And we have all these misadventures of the Hobbit and his 14 companions as they go toward the Lonely Mountain, where this gold is located, all the different things they have to get through. But then the main obstacle is the dragon himself, right? As they get there and they must kill him. Does the story end with the slaying of the dragon? No. And this really proves, I think, how reading it this way is so important. The theme of the story is not that there is just a dragon in the way and Mr. Bilbo finds his courage and helps his friends to slay a dragon. Actually, none of the dwarves nor Bilbo slays the dragon at all. And this is this really gets at how we can see what Tolkien's really trying to say here. It is Bard, a man from Lake Town, that ends up slaying the dragon. And when he ends up slaying the dragon, then the dwarves move into their old kingdom with all of this gold, and the dragon has laid waste to many of the buildings in Lake Town, and there's been much destruction and death, and they are now needing lots of food and are starving. And they come to Thorin for help, and he refuses them. He refuses to give them anything out of the great stores of wealth that he has now come into, quite fortuitously, because he didn't actually slay the dragon that was sitting on that gold. And then the elves, upset that they have no share in the gold, come to and promise aid to the men if they could have a share of the gold. And so there's an army there, and they're about to have this great battle. And what is it that saves the day? The climax of the story, we might have thought, has already come with the slaying of Smaug. But the climax is not there. The climax comes with what Mr. Bilbo actually does. Bilbo, and this is found in the chapter called A Thief in the Night. Near the end, I'll just tell you. And I'll read a section afterwards in a second. But Bilbo takes his share of the treasure, because at the beginning of this whole thing, he was promised a 14th share of the treasure after they had acquired it. And he takes his share of the treasure by taking the Arkenstone, a family heirloom of Thorin's, one that he really desired to have, as it was embellished upon and kind of set in the throne of his grandfather, Thrain. And this glowing, beautiful jewel, Bilbo takes and casts his claim to the treasure against that and says, I'm taking my 14th share. He sneaks out during the middle of the night, goes to the camp of the elves and the men who are preparing to attack the dwarves and slay them. And he says, take this. Take my 14th share of the treasure so that you can bargain with Thor, for Thorin, he holds this very, very dear. And he will come out and will accept it. And you can take your share of the treasure, and we can avoid war this way. Do you see what Tolkien has done here? What is it that saves the day? Is it Bilbo's courage? Well, yes, in a sense. It requires courage to do this thing, right? And this is the courage he ends up finding. The courage he didn't have at the beginning, now he has. But what is it that saves not only himself, but his friends in their lives? It is his willingness to do away with the very thing that he set out on the journey to acquire, the treasure, the desire for treasure, what Tolkien calls dragon sickness, as Thorin becomes so enamored by this gold that he almost is driven mad. This doesn't affect Bilbo because he is humble and lowly to begin with and has no desire for this gold. A very important aspect that then ends up saving his life, the lives of the dwarves, and everyone concerned. There does end up ensuing a battle anyway, because the goblins get there, but they are able to win. The good guys are able to win because of what Mr. Bilbo Baggins has done. And you'll notice if you read The Hobbit that the battle is never really gotten into detail in, because Bilbo is knocked out and he is not conscious for it at all. It's a very disappointing thing, I think, for many people who go from movies to books in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, because Tolkien doesn't find the need to, in gory detail, explain all of these battles. Instead, the point are the characters and the things that they exemplify and symbolize in his story. But after the battle, Bilbo finds Thorin, and he's on his deathbed. And we read this as he enters into the tent where Thorin is being kept. It says, "There indeed lay Thorin, Oakenshield, wounded with many wounds, and his rent armor and notched axe were cast upon the floor. He looked up as Bilbo came beside him. 'Farewell, good thief,' he said. 'I go now to the halls of waiting to sit beside my fathers until the world is renewed, since I leave now all gold and silver and go where it is of little worth. I wish to part in friendship from you, and I would take back my words and deeds at the gate.' Bilbo knelt on one knee, filled with sorrow. 'Farewell, King under the mountain,' he said. 'This is a bitter adventure, if it must end so, and not a mountain of gold can amend it. Yet I am glad that I have shared in your perils. That has been more than any Baggins deserves.' 'No,' said Thorin, 'there is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West, some courage and some wisdom blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer, and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell.' The change of character that comes over Thorin at the end is Tolkien telling us what is this theme that we see here. That if concupiscence is desire, and there is a twisted desire here in The Hobbit, then let me move this here. It is a desire for gold. Gold really meaning earthly, material, possession. It is the lowliness of the Hobbit that allows him to resist this temptation and, in the end, forego his share of the treasure so that his companions, his friends, that their lives may be spared. And he does this in a sense of what we might call tough love. It is not what they desire. They desire the gold. But he knows what they need, and that is to forego it. And in the end, Thorin sees that. A very powerful message indeed from The Hobbit. But this is the concupiscence or the twisted desire found in The Hobbit. What is that? I'm realizing we're going 45 minutes already. That's all right. What is the twisted desire to be found in the Lord of the Rings? The Lord of the Rings is a far bigger epic. J.R. Tolkien spent around 3 years writing The Hobbit before it went to press. He was very different than his friend C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis wrote things very quickly. His first piece of fiction is a book by the name of The Pilgrim's Regress, which he wrote in the late 1920s. And he spent 2 weeks writing it and had one revision and sent it to presses. Tolkien did not operate in that way at all. He spent 3 years writing The Hobbit. It was such an overnight success that his publishers demanded that he write a sequel. 21 years later, he released that sequel. And if he had his druthers, it would have been released like this in a single volume. This was unacceptable to his publishers because this is a very big book and quite unwieldy. And they said, no, you can't do that. And so thus we have 3 instead of 1 Lord of the Rings book. And most people are introduced to Lord of the Rings through the movies, which miss a lot of what he really gets at in many of the Christian themes that are apparent there. And they really do flatten a lot of the characters, unfortunately. And perhaps that's unavoidable just by nature of the medium. But I would like to ask you something that really can kind of be seen in the movies, but not really seen, but in the books. I want to ask you, who is the main character of the Lord of the Rings? Frodo is probably the most obvious answer to that question. He is the one who takes the ring to Mordor. Maybe you could say Aragorn as well, right? The king who comes back to claim his crown. The crownless again shall be king, as the poem says in the story. Maybe it's Gandalf, right? But Gandalf really is the old, wise, sage-like figure. Maybe it is the titular character, the one that is the character from the title. Maybe it is truly the Lord of the Rings. And who is the Lord of the Rings? It is Sauron, right? An evil character who is really not a character at all. He was just the embodiment of evil. He's not meant to have a character. He's meant to just be the devil, right? Essentially. And his lust for power, his desire for power drives him to create this ring. And this is really what the ring represents, right? Is power, domination, the ability to exert one's will on nature or on people. And that's what the ring does. But I would argue, and I got this from Peter Kreeft, and he said this quite a bit more winsomely than I'm saying it now. But he argues that the main character is God. That might seem odd. The Lord of the Rings does not speak of God at all in the explicit sense. It is not an allegory like the Lord or the Chronicles of Narnia are at all. There's no one character that represents God. And in a letter that he wrote to his friend, Tolkien explained that there is a reason why there's no religion, no explicit religion in his world. He creates this vast world and he is meticulous about all the aspects of it, but there are no churches, there are no temples, there are no priests in the Lord of the Rings. Why is that? That seems odd, especially for a world that takes place in this kind of medieval or more primitive society than our own. Of course, there'd be churches on every corner if this was really medieval Europe. Why not? Well, because he said something of that kind of truth is something that the things throughout the story, they reflect. And if religion is in the story, then the symbols that we see throughout and the reflection that these echoes and symbols make, it kind of breaks the analogy. And which is proof why we can see that Tolkien did not mean when he said he wasn't writing an allegory that he didn't have symbols or maybe smaller allegories or analogies or types within his work. But of course, he did have a mythology in the story. He wrote it in what was published after his lifetime, a book called The Silmarillion, which is a very important work, but one that, of course, he didn't publish himself. But he did have many creation stories in it, and one of them, I say many creation stories, there's one creation story told in many ways. And he said this about the God of this universe. It's a monotheistic religion. There is one God. The elves call him Iluvatar. That's their word for God. And the story starts in the Silmarillion, the creation story of Iluvatar creating a host of what we might call seraphim or angelic creatures. And they begin to sing a great song. And Iluvatar, is the director of this great piece, this symphonic piece, where all the voices are coming together in beautiful harmony. And the strongest of the Ainur, that's what the elvish word for these angelic creatures are. The strongest of them is Melkor. And Melkor becomes dissatisfied that his tune is just what was written for him by Iluvatar, and he is forced to comply with it. And so he begins to sing another song, sing something different, and he tries to raise his voice above all the rest. And some find themselves harmonizing to him instead of harmonizing with the set piece that Iluvatar had created. And a couple times Iluvatar reasserts the theme and drives everyone back in line, and Melkor then raises his voice to try to counter Iluvatar and what he's doing. And the third time, Iluvatar stands up from his throne, and all of the Ainur cower in fear. And this is what Iluvatar says when he finally rises out of his seat. Then Iluvatar spoke, and he said, Melkor, or mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor. But that he may know in all the Ainur that I am Iluvatar, these things that ye have sung, I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played, that hath not its uttermost source in me. Nor can any alter the music in my despite, for he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined. What is Tolkien doing there? He's very clearly asserting a very strong doctrine of providence, that God created the world. He created the angelic hosts. Throughout the scriptures, it's hinted at, and maybe tradition embellishes a bit more, that the greatest of these angelic hosts was Lucifer, or Satan. And Satan rose up against the Almighty in his pride, right, and rebelled against him. And yet, cannot Yahweh say, Satan, thou art but mine instrument? That even these things ye try to do in my despite, that is against me, I will still use these things to create things far more wonderful than you could have imagined. And this, of course, is just a huge theme throughout the scriptures themselves, right? Genesis this is the theme of Genesis. How do I know? Because God creates the world. There is a fall. God promises at that fall that something will come and deliver from that fall. And then as an inclusio, as a kind of setting the theme at the beginning and the end, we see the very last chapter of Genesis 50, that as the sons of Jacob come to Joseph, whom they had beaten and sold into slavery, they are afraid for their lives. Joseph says, these things you meant for evil, that you sold me into slavery, but now God has used it for good. That God can take what evil tries to assert, and yet that is part of his will and part of his plan as well. This providence is all throughout the Lord of the Rings. And it is asserted, I think, best in the very beginning of the Lord of the Rings. It's kind of a tragedy, not a tragedy, but at least a misstep, I would say, that Peter Jackson took this part and put it more in the center of the Fellowship of the Ring. But there's a long conversation that Frodo and Gandalf have in Bag End at the beginning of the story. And Frodo says this in that conversation, after he learns of the ring and its destructive power. He says, I wish It need not have happened in my time. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. And already, Frodo, our time is beginning to look back. The enemy is fast becoming very strong. His plans are far from ripe, I think, but they are ripening. We shall be hard put to it. We should be very hard put to it, even if it were not for this dreadful chance. The enemy still lacks one thing, to give him strength and knowledge to beat down all resistance, break the last defenses, and cover all the lands in a second darkness. He lacks the one ring. And I want to skip ahead. For then ensues this more long stories as they talk about the ring and what they ought to do with the ring. And he tells Frodo how the ring got to him. And of course, if you know the Hobbit, you know the ring got to him via Gollum, the creature Gollum who had it for hundreds of years, and then Bilbo won it in the game, the riddle game that he plays with Gollum, or steals it, depending on who you ask. But this is what Gandalf then says about that episode. He says, so now when its master, that is the ring's master, was awake once more and sending out his dark through thought from Mirkwood, it, the ring, abandoned Gollum, only to be picked up by the most unlikely person imaginable, Bilbo from the Shire. Behind that, there was something else at work, beyond any design of the ring-maker. I can put it to no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker, in which case you also were meant to have it. And that may be an encouraging thought. Frodo goes on to say it is not an encouraging thought. But in the end, I think he finds that it is. That is to say, what is Gandalf alluding to? What's he saying without saying it? There's a power beyond the ring. There's a power beyond Sauron, the ring's maker. That is to say, providence exists in the Lord of the Rings. And all of this is bucked at against by those in the Lord of the Rings that desire, and this again goes back to concupiscence and a twisted desire. We'll say this is twisted desire, because this is a longing for power. A longing for power. That's important. The ring represents power. It does not just represent sin. It represents power. Power over nature, power over men. And why is power wrong? Well, power is not inherently wrong. Just like gold is not inherently wrong. It is not wrong to have gold. It is not wrong to be rich. It is hard to be rich and virtuous, as our Lord says, right? It is harder for a camel to enter through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Power is not inherently wrong either. We tend to think that it is, but we do so from a modern standpoint. Because in the modern world, we value liberty, freedom, egalitarianism in the most pure sense. Egalitarianism, which comes from the word equal in the French. And so power to us always looks wrong because we don't want someone to have power over me. We don't like that. We despise authority in all its forms. And so this really is the reigning paradigm. That's not why wanting power is wrong. The Bible doesn't have a modern framework, and it bucks against a modern framework in many respects. And so that's not why power is wrong. It's because the very opposite is true. We might say that this is versus hierarchy. Hierarchy is all throughout the scriptures. And hierarchy is a good thing. there are kings, there are men that are under kings, there are men that are over other men. Even the family unit, right, has a hierarchical structure. Paul talks about this in Ephesians, and that's okay. That's good. So some men have power over other men. Why is it wrong then for someone to have power? In a completely godless world, as posited by the materialists, wanting power is not a bad thing. Many materialists are egalitarian, but I'm not sure why. Nietzsche was correct to assert that if there is no God over us, then the will to power is really what should define morality. And it's not really morality to say that. It's just to say there is no morality. And if I have the ability to exert power over another, then I ought to. Why not? There's no reason why I shouldn't gain power in that way. And so why don't I? Why ought I not do that? Because God exists. And God has all power. He is the Almighty. To desire his role, to play God, is wrong by definition. And that can only be true if God exists. Sauron is so wrong because he's attempting to exert his will over those things that have not been given to him and placed in his charge. And more than that, he is seeking to do things and exert will and control over those things in his charge, but not for their good, for his own good and his own selfish ambition and desires. And that, of course, is also wrong too, right? In a hierarchical structure, it is still good and right for those that have power over other men in a right fashion, in a good fashion, for them to seek the good of those in their control, because that's what God does too, right? God did not just create men to be his slaves. He created men and created a world for them to enjoy. And so a good king brings greater happiness to his subjects than they would have had otherwise. So what makes this twisted desire for power wrong is seen in this framework and not this one. And that's important. Why? And this is why then we can see Aragorn, spoken of, coming back to his kingship as a good thing, even in a world where, or in a story where Tolkien is constantly reminding us that the desire for power is so destructive, right? This doesn't mean it's bad for the king to return. But we see Aragorn show his humility and his lowliness and his real desire for the good of those that are going to be placed in his charge when he finally does come into his crown, into his throne. This twisted desire for power is not only apparent in Sauron. It's really what threatens the mission in general. It's really what threatens to destroy the fellowship of the ring, right? We could spend a whole lecture talking about the fellowship and the friendship of the bonds there, right? The word fellowship in English is one word we use to translate the word koinonia that is used all throughout Paul's letters to describe the fellowship and the bond that we have with Christ and with each other. The word really has to do more with sharing and participating in. As we participate in the body and blood of Christ through the Spirit in the Lord's Supper, so do we participate in each other, in the Lord's bride, in the church. And this is fellowship, true fellowship, right? And it's a very important aspect and doctrine to the Christian church. And yet that bond is threatened all the time in The Lord of the Rings by those who seek power, right? The people that are supposed to be the good guys, that are supposed to have this pull, this connection to each other, they give in to this in different ways, right? Boromir is the obvious example. Not flattened in the way that Peter Jackson flattens him in the movies. He's actually a very good, noble-hearted person throughout most of the book, and it's really at the end that we kind of see him give in to the desire for power. And he justifies it in his mind. He says, I'm doing this for my people. I only want the power to defend my people, he says. And that's a noble and good thing. But his heart is being corrupted by the ring, and he goes against the very vow that he made to defend Frodo and be true to the Fellowship. His father is perhaps even a better example of what happens when one wants to cling to power. Denethor, his father, clings to power and refuses to acknowledge the fact that the king may return and take his stewardship away from him. He's been playing king, even though he's not the king in Gondor. And so if Aragorn returns, he knows this is going to not be good. And so he ends up becoming very evil by the end, becomes very much a character of despair by the end as well. As he clings to his power, he fears so much to lose it that in the end, he's not defending his people. He's not seeking the good of Minas Tirith and the last bastion of Gondor. They're stuck in the city under siege. Instead, he gives in to despair so much that he wants to essentially take the coward's way out, and even at the cost of killing his own son, would take his son with him as they die. Of course, he's thwarted by that, but ends up dying himself. But Faramir, his son, the younger brother to Boromir, is saved. And we see how that desire for power has completely corrupted him. Perhaps this is most exemplified in the character of Gollum, however, right? And this is very, very important. Gollum is described not as a hobbit. He's described in some parts as an ex-hobbit. He used to be a hobbit, but he has been twisted and mangled so much by the ring and his desire for power that he no longer bears the nature of the thing that he was created as. He's no longer the thing he started out as. And what better symbol is that for what sin does to a man? We see that man is created to enjoy and glorify God, right? That is to give glory to him and to take joy in him. That is to find him as his chief desire. And when we do that which is contrary to that, it's not just that we're disobeying. We are that. That is true. We are disobeying God. We're doing something contrary to our very nature. We are not being human by doing that. And the more and more and more we give in to sin, the less and less human we look. And I think Dante would have said, if he were walking through the circles of hell and looking at all of those souls, or maybe even in the eschaton, looking at all of those bodies, right, when our bodies and souls are reunited together, looking at those men, he could have said, just as Frodo or Sam looking at Gollum could have said, I'm not sure that that's a human. I think that might be an ex-human. That is, he's no longer is he human, because they have given into their sin so much. They are no longer doing anything remotely comparable to what the nature of humanity is. That's what sin does, and the twisted desire, concupiscence, does to us. And so we see that exemplified. Frodo, like Bilbo, shows us in his lowly character, though, an ability to fight that. While all the men around him have great virtue, this pre-Christian virtue we've talked about of valor and courage, the ability to fight even the midst of great danger. The hobbits don't have that virtue, but they do have the virtue of lowliness, of humility, that Christian virtue that is not present in the old pagan myths and stories. And that's what gives them their strength, because they are not seeking power. They are not seeking to be amongst the very wise, nor amongst the very powerful and strong, or kings of men. And yet, what does Tolkien do at the end of the story? I'll bring us to the very end. This is, of course, right at the end, at the cracks of Doom, Mount Doom, the only place that the ring can be destroyed. And it's told from Sam's perspective, as Frodo's already gone in. The light sprang up again, and there on the brink of the chasm, at the very crack of Doom, stood Frodo, black against the glare, tense, erect, but still as if he had been turned to stone. "Master!" cried Sam. Then Frodo stirred and spoke with a clear voice. Indeed, with a voice clearer and more powerful than Sam had ever heard him use. And it rose above the throb and turmoil of Mount Doom, ringing in the roof and walls. "I have come," he said, "but I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine." And suddenly, as he set it on his finger, he vanished from Sam's sight. Sam gasped, but he had no chance to cry out, for at that moment, many things happened. If you watched the movie or read the book, you know exactly what those many things were. Gollum, in his desire for power and for the ring itself, knocks Sam to the ground with a rock and struggles with Frodo for the ring. And after biting his finger off, acquires said ring, but in the midst of the struggle falls over the edge of the chasm and takes the ring to its doom. This really is the opposite way of telling a story about a hero than almost any other story. Typically, when you have, this is just the kind of rule of thumb, the way they teach you to write stories and heroes, particularly in these kind of fantasy sci-fi settings, that you have a main character, right? He's protagonist. And he starts with some kind of vice, some kind of, some will even call it a misbelief, something that he believes about himself or the world that is not true. And through struggling, he begins to get to a point where that is tested over and over again. And at the end, perhaps it's more like he's struggling and struggling and struggling. And there's one point in which it's really tested. We call this the divine, or the deep cave. And in which that's really tested, he comes out the other side. And at the end, because he comes out the other side and his belief is changed and he overcomes this vice, and instead of being maybe a selfish person, now he's a selfless person, or he's at least learned to not be a selfish person. He can succeed and overcome the obstacle, and we have the climax of the story, right? A easy example of this to see is a story like Iron Man, right? Iron Man is this very narcissistic person at the beginning, has no cares except for himself, and at the end he learns to not be a narcissist and to care for others, and it is through that he's able to save the day. That's not how The Lord of the Rings is written. The protagonist does learn the virtue of courage. He does learn many things through these struggles, but when he does go through some really deep, dark things like Shelob's Cave and comes out the other side. But when he gets to the climax, we'll call this the climax here, he fails. And what saves the day? You could say Gollum. That's inadvertent. He didn't mean to destroy the ring. Instead, what happens is the victory comes out of nowhere. This we might call, or Tolkien might call, the eucatastrophe. catastrophe with EU on the front. Because it comes out of nowhere, but it's a good thing. A catastrophe is like the flood, a terrible, destructive thing that comes upon the world seemingly out of nowhere. It really comes from God. And all these terrible things happen, right? A eucatastrophe is that, but the reverse. And the main character, the one who is set up as the hero to destroy the ring, can't destroy the ring in the end. Thus, bringing me back to what I said before, bringing us back to what Peter Kreeft said, the main character of this story, the one really driving all the action, is not Frodo. It's not Sam. It's not Aragorn or Gandalf. And it's not the villains like Sauron or Saruman, etc. It's God. Because none of those characters, those two characters there at the very end who had access to the ring, neither of them wanted to destroy it at the end of the day. And yet God had set up that scene to happen such that it would be destroyed, even in spite of both of Gollum and Frodo's twisted desire for the ring. Frodo was meant to have the ring. In that same discussion that we read at the beginning between Frodo and Gandalf, Gandalf chastises Frodo for wanting to kill Gollum. Not because Gollum deserves to live. He says, sure, yeah, he deserves to die. That's not what I'm getting at. He says, but A, you shouldn't be so quick to deal out death and judgment. As in, it's not your place to be the judge. That's something that I think people miss. When we say it's not your place to judge, we're not saying that the person may not actually deserve said judgment. They may. You're not the judge, though. You're not king. That's maybe a better way to put it. While a person may deserve justice, you may not be the king to administer it, and you need to humble yourself. And so Gandalf chastises him that way. But then he also says, and my heart tells me that Gollum has a part to play in this still. He doesn't know quite how, but he's right in that estimation. While it would have been righteous for Gollum to be executed for the many terrible things he's done, his living proved to be instrumental in the destruction of the ring. Something that I think we should think about more often in the ways that we deal with people, right? I mean, there is what is right, but God is the one that is in control. We're not king. And we need to humble ourselves and do what is right with the things we've been given, and not try to play king, not try to play God. And so that really kind of brings us full circle, right? God is the main character here in the entirety of the Lord of the Rings. And this really goes contrary to everything we know about storytelling and protagonist arcs. I want to read for us as a way to close out our time together. A very important passage. And this is from Romans 16. I want you to take this away with you as you read. This is Paul closing out the letter. He has actually two closings to the letter. And the first is here from 17 to, here you can't see me, from 17 through 20. The second is here at the end, from 25 to 27. We're going to look at the first ending. Now I beseech you, brethren, mark them which cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine which ye have learned, and avoid them. For they that are such serve not our Lord Jesus Christ, but their own belly. We see what's he getting at? Concupiscence, right? The desire for worldly things, here exemplified in gluttony. And by good works and fair speeches deceive the hearts of the simple. For your obedience is come abroad unto all men. I am glad, therefore, on your behalf. But yet I would have you wise unto that which is good, and simple concerning evil. That's an old way of saying, I would have you know how to act well. Simple, that is ignorant, to how to act evil in an evil manner. And then notice this. And the God of peace shall bruise Satan under your feet shortly. Wait a second. What is that referencing? That is Paul referencing Genesis 3. That when God curses the serpent, he's going to send someone to bruise, that is, to crush the serpent under his heel. But Paul says that's what is going to happen to you, Romans, the Roman church. And therefore, by implication, the church at large. That is us. But it's still God that's the one that's the active one here, right? God will crush Satan under your feet. God is the author of all things. And I mean that in a very literary sense. God authored history. And through that, he writes our stories and uses us as his instruments. And we indeed do actually crush evil in that. But we do so by being his instruments and by being united to his Son, who most certainly crushed the head of the serpent as he died an atoning death, which we will celebrate here in 4 short days, and was raised incorruptible, which we will celebrate in 6 short days. And through that crushed the power of hell and Satan, the great accuser, that dragon of old. And this is not lost on the author of The Lord of the Rings, who never explicitly mentions the name of Christ or the name of Yahweh in his works, but throughout is showing how providence is using these characters and using them as his instruments. And so while Melkor and while Sauron and while those that are evil hate to hear the words of Iluvatar that says, thou art but mine instrument. And that's true in this world, right? Satan, those who despise the authority of God, the king, they hate to hear those words, thou art but mine instrument. But we as Christians love to hear those words, thou art mine instrument. For that means that we are going to hear at the end of all things, well done, my good and faithful servant. So I would encourage you with those words today. Do you long to hear those words? Thou art mine instrument. Well done, my good and faithful servant. Take those with you as you go, and remember, read good fiction. It is important. It blesses the soul and it enriches the soul, especially if the author is very self-consciously trying to point you to Christ. The Lord's blessing with you all. I hope you enjoyed that, so maybe rather wordy, long lecture on The Lord of the Rings. Tomorrow we'll be here with something else, as I said, probably on piety and talking about prayer, the importance of prayer. And so I look forward to seeing you then. The Lord bless you. Y'all have a good one.